Okay, hello everybody. This is Sophie from Spark Policy Institute. Thank you for joining us again today. Today's webinar, which is jointly hosted by the Colorado Farm to School Task Force and Spark Policy Institute, is called Making Evaluation Easy, Choosing and Adapting Data Collection Tools for Your Farm to School Evaluation. We've got almost everybody on, so we'll go ahead and get started. A few housekeeping points one more time so that everybody's on the same page. There are two ways to hear audio for today's webinar. It looks like most of you, it's coming through your computer. You can also join the teleconference using the call-in number listed on your screen and in the chat box. We do currently have everybody on mute, and we will be holding question and answer periods through the chat function on the right side of your screen. Again, please make sure that send to all panelists is selected so that we can read everybody the answers. I do want to let you know that today's webinar will be recorded, and the recording will be posted on the Colorado Farm to School website. On the screen, you will see links to handouts that you will need for today's webinar. You can either type them directly into your browser or copy and paste them. Please note that the attachments have been recently updated as of September 12th, so you may want to download them again to make sure that all the links in the document are working properly. So without further ado, I will hand you over to our presenter, Lynn Kathleen from Spark.
Thank you, Sophie. Well, it's great to have you all back. This is our third week, and I feel like I know all of you, even though I don't see you. But it is really wonderful to do this. We're having a good time, and I appreciate it when people also go to our survey at the end and give us feedback, because that has been helping us as we continue to develop each one of these webinars in the series. Quickly, a little bit of background about Spark, as you've heard before, but we were chosen to staff the Colorado Farm to School Task Force, and we are a national change agent organization. We collaborate with nonprofits, foundations, policymakers, and communities to find innovative, dynamic solutions to those things that are really messy and complex. For the task force, we provide a wide range of services, including research, regulatory and legal analysis, evaluation, facilitation, and training. The task force has 15 appointed members, and it is charged with increasing the use of local farm and ranch products in school food service programs in Colorado to improve the child nutrition and strengthen our local and regional agricultural economies. The task force receives no funding from the state of Colorado. However, it has successfully attracted a wide array of funders, starting with the federal ARA stimulus grant. With a 2-year USDA Farm to School grant, the toolkit that was created by the Colorado Farm to School Task Force and Spark Policy Institute is now being rolled out nationwide through in-person workshops and webinar trainings. Today's webinar is the third in a 5-part series of the toolkit training. We'll be focusing on how to choose and adapt an existing data collection instrument. All the webinars are archived at the link on this slide. Sophie will start us off with a quick poll.
Okay, hi everybody. We're just interested in learning who attended or viewed the webinar series to date. So on the right side, a poll will open up. You'll have 30 seconds to answer. And we'd just like to know if you've seen both, one, or none of the previous webinars in the series. Okay, we have about 5 seconds left. Okay, great. It looks like most of you have seen both, or at least one of the previous webinars. So great, welcome back.
Thank you, Sophie. Okay, let's get started. You should have received these handouts. Once again, we, of course, kind of keep drumming this into you because the handouts are an important component of doing these trainings. What we're going to be doing today is working on steps 3 and 4. If you have not done steps 1 and 2, either because you haven't finished them or because you are just joining us today, no worries. You can always go back and do those offline today. You will need one of the 7 attachments. So if you already know which target group that you are evaluating, it's great to have that attachment ready too. We'll give you a moment to pull that attachment later in the webinar training, so don't worry and don't need to scramble at this very minute to find it. Today, we're going to start with a brief overview of what we've already covered in the last 2 webinars. Then we're going to jump right into selecting measurement tools, reviewing the content of existing tools, determine if it's a good fit for your evaluation, and then how to identify and adapt those questions to better fit your needs. A critical step in preparing for an evaluation is to validate that your data collection instrument is functioning properly. So we're going to discuss that in terms of how you pre-test your questions. We'll end with a slide that directs you to the remaining trainings and opens it up for the final Q&A. Along the way, we'll be stopping and asking questions through polls and soliciting ideas through the chat box. Great. One moment, please. By the end of the 60-minute training, you will have increased your understanding about different types of data collection methods. You'll have made progress on selecting one or more existing data collection tools for your evaluation. You'll understand how to adapt in an existing tool and how to ensure your new version will be collecting the information you intend to collect. And you'll continue along the journey of increasing your confidence to undertake an evaluation. Let's first start with a brief overview of the toolkit. The toolkit overview walks you through each step of the evaluation process. 2 weeks ago, we started with the overview of the toolkit and began filling in step 1 of the evaluation template. Last week, we identified outcomes and target audiences for your evaluation. Today, we're focusing on step 3, selecting and adapting your data collection instruments to measure those outcomes, and we'll get started on step 4 of completing your evaluation plan. In our webinar series, we cover every step, and you'll work with the template and the attachments. Let's briefly review those outcomes before we get started on today's training. Last week, we introduced you to several key concepts to better understand outcomes. We talked about the sphere of control, which are those things we have control over. These are the activities, deliverables, milestones, and outputs of our farm-to-school programs. These are the things that we do. It's our outputs. But it does not measure the reasons that we do the work we do. That work falls under the sphere of influence. And within the sphere of influence, the outcomes that can be categorized are short, intermediate, and long-term. These are the changes in learning, action, and systems, and capture the why we do the work that we do. We also introduced you to a logic model to help you better articulate the activities of your program and the outcomes expected from those activities. Several of you commented in our post-webinar survey that you now have a better understanding of where your outcomes fall and that some of those outcomes were too far down the road to realistically evaluate at this point in your program. This is a great example of how a logic model can help you design an effective evaluation. Let's take a quick look at some of those outcomes you all shared with us last week. Remember that short-term outcomes are those that are most closely related to your farm-to-school activities. So learning is the first thing that we see. Learning can be increased awareness, knowledge gaining, attitudes, opinions, aspirations, and motivations. Last week, we asked folks about the types of outcomes they want to evaluate, and this slide shows some of those answers and demonstrates the different types of learning. We also had folks mention intermediate-term outcomes. Intermediate-term outcomes are actions. These include changes in behavior, practices, decision-making, and internal policies. Several of you identified the outcomes of changing eating habits of the children. One person identified a decrease in the cafeteria waste, specifically tossing out fruits and vegetables. And one person identified the environmental outcome of decreasing the miles food travels from its source to consumption in the schools. Finally, some of you identified long-term outcomes that you want to assess. Long-term outcomes consist of system changes and conditions at the social, health, environmental, economic level. It also includes changes in culture, policy, rules, and regulations that affect multiple systems. Long-term impacts are the hardest to evaluate, yet we often think about farm-to-school efforts with those long-term outcomes in mind. Let's take a look at long-term impacts that you all identified. One was changes in the habits of parents that occurred through their children's exposure to farm to school. This is an indirect outcome and one that signals a family cultural shift in eating habits, definitely a long-term outcome. Another was to increase the local purchasing for improving health and supporting economic development. This, too, captures big outcomes. This is population health and economic health outcomes. One was to keep farmers on the land and be viable as something that will only happen actually over quite a bit of time. A farm-to-school program may be the impetus for opening up such local markets, but it may not be the only driver of this outcome. So it's important to remember when you're thinking about long-term outcomes, what are the other potential things that are also driving it? And then, of course, speaking of big long-term outcomes, is that of reducing obesity. Basically, this is one that most all of you likely think about or will have on your logic model outcomes. But it is also one that is very far off and very far removed from your farm-to-school programming. Obesity reduction will be the result of many changes, of which farm-to-school is an important piece. For those of you on last week's webinar, you have begun and hopefully continued identifying the outcomes you want to evaluate. So I want to stop for a moment and see where folks are at. Please type into the chat box the target audience, so that's going to be your attachment focus, like did you pick attachment 1 with students or attachment 3 with teachers? And then also tell us one of the outcomes you're focusing on. And so please describe that. Don't just give me the number, maybe just a short description of what that outcome is. So please remember to submit it to all panelists. That way, actually, both Sophie and I can see your answers. And as they come in, I'll read them. So it would be great if several of you could just join in that exercise so we can see where folks are at. So I know people are typing. Great. Here's one. Students is the target audience, and the outcome is knowledge gain and awareness about gardening after participating in classroom and on-site garden activities lessons. Great. That's fabulous. Thank you. Here's another one. We've selected the outcome of farm-to-school cafeterial offerings, increased servings of fruits and vegetables. Excellent. I'll wait for one more. There's some pressure for somebody. Here's one on community. And this is the community outcome is an awareness of the importance for eating healthy, and especially in the schools. I love that somebody is using the community outcomes. Okay, so if you didn't get a chance to share in that one, don't worry, we always have more opportunities, but let's get back to the training. Now we're going to turn our attention to different types of methods. For our purposes, we're going to categorize these into 2 types. The first thing you'll want to do is decide what type of methodology you want to use. Do you want your data to be mainly quantitative? If you are collecting data from a lot of people, surveys with what we call close-ended questions are ideal. Information reported out in numerical formats like percentages or graphics are often seen as more objective information and therefore provide more compelling evidence of program impact. Quantitative data can provide you with information about the what's and the how much of what is happening in your program. But if you want to know about the whys and the how a program is affecting your population, you're going to need to collect qualitative data. Conducting interviews or holding focus groups with participants in your farm-to-school program can yield rich information about their experiences and perspectives. It can elicit ideas and even uncover insights not previously considered. Qualitative methods, however, are time-consuming to set up and implement, and the data can be a little bit overwhelming to analyze. Because qualitative methods cannot be conducted with a large number of people, and the analysis relies on reading and finding themes or key concepts, it's often considered more subjective than quantitative data. Many evaluations use what is called a mixed method approach. both quantitative and qualitative data methods are used because neither method alone can generate all the information needed to fully understand the impact of a program. One word of advice here. If you are doing an evaluation to report to an external group, say a funder, it's important to find out what method they find acceptable. So you don't want to jump in and just do qualitative if your funder, for example, is really looking for you to give them numbers and counts. Be sure you know what it is that your external group wants to see and is compelling for them to see. Qualitative and quantitative methodological techniques fall along a continuum. Here we can see that a method called participant observation is on the far end of the qualitative methods, and surveys are on the far end of the quantitative methods. A variety of other methods fall between the two ends, including open-ended interviews. These are more like a conversation where your questions are unscripted and it emerges out of a discussion, to focus groups, and then semi-structured interviews, document reviews, and then observations with predefined scoring categories. Each method has its advantages and drawbacks. There is no right method. Rather, the best method will be dependent upon several factors, including your evaluation purpose, the resources you have available, your target audience, and your timeline. For example, are you primarily needing to answer questions about what are students learning in the garden lessons, or do you need to answer questions around how students best learn in the gardens? The what questions can be answered through surveys, online or paper. The how questions need to be asked through a qualitative method like observing students learning about plant cycles or interviewing them about their learning experiences. Let's take a look at the purposes, advantages, and challenges of different types of data collection methods. Observational techniques are methods by which you gather firsthand data on programs, processes, and behaviors being studied. This is useful to assess the implementation of a program, where the observations can help determine whether or not those activities are being delivered as planned. Observation overcomes self-reporting biases, which can occur in surveys, and reveal information that people may be uncomfortable sharing in focus groups or interviews. However, observational data can be challenging to collect, difficult to analyze, and your presence can influence bias or even distract participants. An in-depth interview is a dialogue between a trained interviewer and an interviewee. Its goal is to elicit rich, detailed material that can be used in your evaluation. Interviews are best conducted face-to-face, although telephone interviewing can be successful. Typically, the project evaluator prepares an interview guide that includes a list of questions or issues that are to be explored and has suggested probes for following up on key topics. In-depth interviews can be used at any stage in the evaluation process. They're especially useful in answering questions such as, what does the program look like or feel like to a participant, or maybe to other stakeholders? What are the experiences of those program participants? How do stakeholders know about the project? What thoughts do stakeholders have concerning the program? What are the participants' or stakeholders' expectations? And what features of the project are most important to those participants? Among the challenges, interviews can be time-consuming to set up and conduct. The data can be difficult to analyze, although we will discuss ways to make it easier in next week's training. Focus groups combine elements of both interviewing and participant observation. It allows observation of group dynamics, discussion, and firsthand insights into the respondents' behaviors, attitudes, and language as they're interacting with each other and answering your questions. Focus groups are useful in answering the same types of questions as in-depth interviews, except it's in a social context. Focus groups are well suited for identifying and defining problems in project implementation, for identifying project strengths and weaknesses and recommendations, for assisting in the interpretation of quantitative findings, and for generating new ideas. The challenge of focus groups is similar to observational and interview data in that it can be hard to analyze it. An additional challenge is the need to have a skilled facilitator conduct the session so as to keep the group on task and get the most out of the discussion through thoughtful probes. Finally, a survey is most appropriate when the information you need is best answered by the participant themselves. For example, if we want people's own reports of their opinions, attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors. Surveys are the least resource-intensive method, and because they gather information in well-defined categories, it's often easier to analyze than qualitative data. However, surveys too can generate a lot of data, and it may require someone skilled in handling numerical data. Here's another way to think about it. Here's a guide about method versus audience. And so it really is about trying to figure out, is there a method that is better for your target audience? And so, for example, the best method to use with adults and teachers, whether they are involved in your program directly or indirectly, is really all of those methods that we just talked about, except, of course, the observational method with adults who are not involved in the method or in your program directly, because it's just not applicable. When collecting, the best method for collecting from leaders is actually an interview, and this is mainly because leaders tend to be very busy people, and they will be less likely to respond to an invitation to take a survey or join a focus group. When you're collecting data from diverse participants, ideally you would utilize someone from the community and cultural group of your target audience. You'll also need to ensure your data collection instruments are culturally appropriate. The range in each of these cells represents that there are better and worse ways to implement the method. When it comes to students, data collection can be tricky. You'll notice that observational techniques are good to use with the youngest children, but maybe not quite as good to use with the older children. This is really because the presence of the evaluator and data collector is more likely to affect the behavior of the older children than the younger ones. Now, while this table can help you think about the appropriate method for your audience, remember it is only a guide. Okay, let's move on to selecting an existing measurement tool and discuss how to assess its fit for your program and then how to adapt it if needed. The Farm to School Evaluation Toolkit has 7 attachments, one for each of those specific groups that's affected by farm to school efforts. At the beginning of this webinar, we mentioned in the intro screen, and Sophie also mentioned that the attachments have been updated. For the purposes of today's training, it really doesn't matter if you have the most recent version or not, but we do encourage you to download the latest version at your earliest chance. This particular screenshot should look familiar to everyone. It's the screenshot of Attachment 1, Outcomes for Students. And as a reminder, last week we took a closer look at each attachment, and I want to just go over it just very, very quickly. On the far right column is information about the type of outcomes, such as student knowledge. In this next column, we actually list a specific type of outcome. Here, we see outcome number 1, which is about student gains in knowledge and awareness about gardening and school gardens. The next column has a short description of the type of programming activities that are likely to align with that outcome. This next column describes the type of measurement tools that we have found that address the outcome. And finally, in the last column, we point you to a specific data collection tool or tools that have been used to measure this outcome. This is actually the column that we're really going to be focusing on today. So let's take a look at student outcome number 2, just for a change. Students, this one is students' gains in knowledge and awareness about agriculture, local foods, and seasonality. Here we've identified several instruments that can be used as pre- and post-test knowledge surveys. In addition to the survey links, we also provide a short description. Here you can see that the first tool is recommended for 5th and 6th graders, while the second tool is appropriate for 6 to 12-year-olds. Let's look more closely at a tool. As mentioned before, a survey is most appropriate when the information you need is best answered by the participant themselves. This is a survey that's measuring knowledge of the individual. A survey or questionnaire is a good instrument to test knowledge and learning. This particular survey is interesting in that it covers a lot of disparate topics. Some are knowledge about the sources of food, some about growing food, some about parts of the food, and one is about the experience of going to a farm. The instrument also contains questions about willingness to try new food. There is nothing wrong with putting all these types of questions together in one survey, or even within one section of the survey. However, depending on the age of your student, you may want to organize the survey more thematically or just focus on one topic area. Let's look at another example. This screenshot is from the producer attachment number 5. Notice that not everything is a survey. Some things will be interview questions, some that we have found are focus group questions, and others are observational tools. Here's an example of a producer interview instrument. It has both questions to ask the producer as well as prompts about the data to collect from each producer. Questions include their knowledge about the farm-to-school program as it pertains to the school salad bar, questions about how their growing practices have changed because of their farm-to-school interactions, and a question about the cost-effectiveness of selling to schools. Indicators to gather are the prompts to the interviewer to ask for data from the producer that is likely tracked in his or her records already. Here is a student focus group protocol. As you can see, you do not need to ask a lot of questions in a focus group. One question will generate a lot of discussion, so you never go into a focus group session with pages and pages of questions. Finally, here is an example of an observational tool. This particular one is heavily scripted, and it has very specific information to record. Each one of these tools and many more are available in your evaluation toolkit and are hyperlinked in the attachments. Now it's time to download, if you haven't already, a data collection instrument that has already been identified for one of the outcomes you're going to evaluate. As I'm talking to you about adapting a measurement tool, you might want to have your tool available just so you can think about the concepts I introduce in the context of the tool you want to use. So that we know when you're ready to move on, please click on the poll answer, "I'm ready," and when 2/3 of you have indicated that you're ready to move on, we'll move on. So it's in your collective interest to answer this poll. Okay, everybody, get those instruments and then tell us when you're ready to go. I would like to open it up for any questions people might have. So while you are multitasking, I guess, downloading that instrument, you can also type into the chat box questions that you might have, and we'll be glad to stop just for a moment and answer some of those. Okay, I am looking. Are there any questions? No? How are we doing on downloading? Okay, we have almost 50% of you ready. Okay, I'm going to give you maybe 30 more seconds. Okay, it looks like we are ready to go. Terrific. Okay, now we're going to turn to adapting measurement tools. And honestly, this can seem like a pretty daunting task, but there are some great processes and steps that are very straightforward, and it will make this a relatively easy task. It is a task, though, that you want to do carefully and you want to put thought and time into. The first place to start is to determine if the question on an existing instrument, even if it fits your program, meets a set of criteria for inclusion in your evaluation instrument. So, what you want to do here is you want to remember you really have limited time and resources to conduct and analyze your evaluation data. So you want to be sure you're getting the very most out of every question. And you also want to make sure that you're not duplicating your questions and, missing certain ones that you could have done, but then you later realize that you basically asked the same type of question or got the same kind of information twice. So how do you select which questions are best for your evaluation? Sometimes it's useful to have a scoring table, such as this one. Here we see 8 criteria that are likely to be relevant to your own evaluation efforts. You can certainly adapt this table to fit your specific needs. So, for example, if your purpose is not for a program improvement, maybe it's to share with stakeholders, then you would take out the program improvement line and say, share with stakeholders. But generally speaking, you would use this kind of table and put in the criteria that makes sense for you. And a lot of the criteria here will make sense for many of you. Using a process like this can help you control the urge to ask every good question you come across. An important thing to remember as you're putting together your evaluations tool is to stay focused on what's most important given the purpose of your evaluation. It's important also that you don't go overboard asking so many questions that your respondents will lose interest in completing a survey or collecting so much data that you don't have the capacity to analyze it. There's a lot written on what is and what isn't a good evaluation question. Let's take a look at a couple. First is the rule of wording. It is actually not as simple as you might think. Wording questions to obtain the intended information and to be understood by all respondents can be a little bit challenging. So when reviewing an existing question or writing your own, consider these 3 things. The particular people for whom the questionnaire is being designed. In other words, your questions need to be appropriately worded for your target audience. The particular purpose of the questionnaire. So if it's for program improvement, the types of questions will be different than if it is for sharing information with stakeholders. And then finally, how those questions will be placed in relation to each other in the questionnaire. We talked before about how it can be useful to put similar questions together, but other question placement issues can include when you would ask the demographic questions or the order of questions based on, say, increasing content knowledge that you're testing. You always want to use simple wording. You're not trying to talk down to your participants, but rather you want to make sure you're not introducing any confusion or potential misunderstanding. Simple words and simple sentence structure are important. Be specific. Don't use terms that can be defined in multiple ways. Instead, state exactly what you mean. So if you're asking a question about how often a child eats vegetables, don't make your choices never, a little, an average amount, or a lot, as these will mean different things to different people. Instead, be very specific. Not at all, 1 time a day, 2 times a day, 3 or more times a day. Don't ask too demanding of questions. People will simply not answer them, or worse still, they may just opt out of the entire survey if they see one. Use mutually exclusive categories. Make sure that only one answer is possible, or if more than one answer is possible, make sure you give them the option that they can choose more than one answer. And then finally, you need to avoid biased questions. Biased questions influence people to respond in a certain way. So for this one, I want to give you some examples and see if you can find the bias in these examples. So I'm going to put up the question, and then you're going to type into the chat box how that particular question is biased. Okay, here we go. The first question is, more farmers in Seymour County are using Superb than any other variety of alfalfa. Do you use Superb? And your choices are no and yes. Write into the chat box how this question is biased. Excellent. Here they come. First sentence of the question frames it as something everyone is doing. Yes. It's biased in favor of superb since more farmers are using it. Yes. Citing the statistic that more farmers use it gives the impression that you want them to agree and say yes. Oh, you guys are good. You're good. You're good. So this is perfect. That's exactly what the problem is here with that question. And so let's move on to the next one. And as you can see, this question implies the respondent should use superb. Okay, next question. How would you rate the housing in which you live? Is it satisfactory? Is it good? Or is it excellent? Okay, what's the bias in this question? Okay, wow, you're fast on this one. No option for negative responses. All three things mean the same thing. There is no bad. You guys got it. Okay, no negative options provided. Let's see if I can give you a little bit harder one. Do you agree that funding for extension in your county should be increased? Your choices are no and yes. What's biased about this one? Okay, first one in, there is no other response options like not sure. Asking for agreement with the questionnaire, yes, by asking, do you agree? That it is framed as agreeing. Need more information. What is the funding level currently? Ooh, that's a good one. That's a good one. Because it does assume, right? It does assume the person has some kind of level of information about that. Unless that question is being set up to be a perception question where it's not about knowledge but their perceptions. So these are all very good, and let's take a look at not just what the bias is, but how you could maybe fix that bias. So this is definitely a leading question because it does use agree. Do you agree? A better question would be really, do you agree or disagree that extension funding should be increased? And a better set of answers to get at more of the nuances here would be a scale, a Likert type scale, going from strongly disagree to strongly agree. Okay, you guys did great. I gave you some pretty straightforward questions on bias, but clearly you had your hats on and your lenses about how to look at bias. You want to remember all of these particular rules about how to create good survey questions and good interview questions, really. And so bias is a big one because oftentimes when we're putting things together, you know, we're just typing it out as the way it makes sense to us, and we are so close to the issues that we may in fact not realize that we have inadvertently added bias. And then of course if you're using somebody else's instrument, you always want to be very careful and look at that, and if there's bias and the other kinds of rules that we've talked about for good survey questions. I just want to add a little caveat there that the various instruments that we have looked at and included in the toolkit, we have done quite a bit of vetting to make sure that they in fact do represent good survey or good questionnaire rules. But, you know, some of those may still have fallen through the cracks. There could be a question or two on what else is a really good and solid instrument that is in fact not a great question. So please don't assume that every instrument we found for you is perfect. What we found were instruments that are pretty good. Okay, let's move on. Here's a snapshot of one section of the Wisconsin Farm to School 2010-11 student survey. It collects a lot of data in a very succinct way. Each fruit is pictured, and then the same set of simple questions is asked for each of the fruits. Have you ever seen, for example, have you ever eaten an apple? And your options are to say yes or no. And if you say yes, the follow-up is, did you like it? And you can say yes or no. And if the student said they'd never eaten an apple, for example, then the follow-up is, would you try one? And the options are yes, no, or maybe. Now, this repetition makes this survey very easy to complete. It's a really nice kind of way to set it up. However, it still requires the ability to read. What if you wanted to use a survey like this with first graders? Well, you can use it with some slight adaptations. So instead of using the words yes and no, you might use a check mark or for a yes or an X for a no. Or if you wanted to ask the question, would you try this particular fruit or vegetable, you could use a thumbs up for yes, a thumbs down for no, and a question mark for maybe. Or another option is to use the old reliable smiley faces for questions about whether a young child likes an item or doesn't like an item. Some existing instruments are asking questions you may want to ask, but others are asking questions along the same lines as you would want to ask them. Adapting a survey instrument can mean swapping out words, like the list of local foods on one survey instrument may not match your local foods, but adapting an instrument can also be about using the ideas and the format represented in the instrument. Here we see a student knowledge survey. This is a great example of a survey format that is well suited for a pre-post test of farm-to-school nutrition education programs because it is assessing knowledge. If one of your outcomes is increased knowledge about healthy food and healthy eating, then doing a pre-post test is the best way to demonstrate your program's impact. Of course, you'll want your pre-post test to be assessing the knowledge on information that's actually taught in your nutrition classes. So if you thought this looked like a promising instrument, you would need to check if the curriculum taught in your school is actually in line with the questions in this instrument. And while you're looking through that school's curriculum, you could start to jot down additional questions that look like ones that are really good ones to test on and use this kind of style if you like the way that this was set up. Now let's turn to validating your survey for your population, which is really simply testing your survey instrument. No matter what type of data collection tool you use, and even if you're using one that is verbatim of one that we have found for you and it's been used somewhere else, you still need to test its validity with your population and the ease of its administration with your data collectors. So example, if you're doing interviews or holding focus groups, you're going to want to make sure that those interview protocols or those focus groups questions really work for the people who are actually collecting the data for you. So let's look at pre-testing questions, whether this is a survey or interview. I'm about to show you 7 different areas that you would want to assess. But before I do, I want you to understand that these are just really common sense areas that you would check. In fact, most of these are going to sound very familiar to you at this point in the training because they are things we've already talked about. So for example, when you pre-test an instrument, the types of questions and answers you want to get at are, does each question measure what it was intended to measure? So you're really looking at, are you collecting the data that you thought you would be collecting, or are you getting answers that make no sense to you because that's not what you attempted to ask, in which case it might be that your question just really is not clearly stated. Do respondents understand all the words? Literally, this is one you might simply ask. If you're doing a questionnaire with some younger children, you would want to ask them, or even middle-aged children, you would want to ask them if all of the words that you were using or all of the images you're using make sense to them. Are the questions interpreted the same way by all respondents? So this really gets at, is everybody seeing that question in the same way? Because you don't want to end up with a bunch of different answers simply because you are seeing the questions interpreted differently by the different kinds of respondents that are answering it. Does each close-ended question have an answer that is applicable to each respondent? So you don't want to end up with a person who is answering a question and they don't see an option that makes any sense to them. Does the questionnaire motivate people to answer it? So we've all done questionnaires where we're like, are you kidding me? That's the stupidest question ever. You don't want those questions. So make sure that it's a question that seems interesting, that, you know, they'll really want to answer it. And are the answer choices correct? So make sure, you know, double check that you're not giving answer choices that you've got an incorrect answer in there. And then, of course, does any part of your question suggest a bias? So many of the instruments we found, you should know, have not been quote unquote validated in a research method way. They really have simply been used, but they have been, in our estimate, looked as though they were really very solidly constructed and quite useful. But because they haven't truly been validated, and of course because they haven't been used with your population, you need to do your own pretesting. So what's this process look like when you pretest? It's really quite straightforward. The very first thing you're going to want to do is have your evaluation team members review and try it out, especially those who have not been involved in the development and adaptation of the instrument. No doubt this process will uncover some hiccups, so you'll want to revise the instrument before you test it on your target audience. You definitely want to have your target audience testing your instrument. With your target audience, you'll want to simulate the data collection procedure. So if it's a telephone survey, don't do it in person, test it as a telephone survey. If it's a web-based survey, don't give your target audience person a hard copy of it. Have them test it online. For each question or page, you'll want to obtain feedback from your testers. You'll want them to tell you if your question was clear and were the answers sufficient to capture their experiences. Basically, these are the questions that we just covered on the previous slide. And if they're taking the survey online, you might be thinking, well, how in the world am I going to ask those questions? They're doing it online. I'm not even interacting with them. Well, you can do this by simply adding little open-ended boxes at the bottom of each of your pages of your online survey that just simply ask the tester for feedback on the questions on this particular page. After your testing is over, you can go in and remove those tester feedback boxes from your online survey, and you'll be ready to go. You'll also want to look at the answers collected from the testers. So do their answers make sense? Again, are they like, giving you answers that are not what you intended, what you thought you would get when you asked that question? That's going to be a real clue that something is wrong with the way you asked the question. And then finally, you're going to revise it. It is the rare data collection instrument that does not need to be revised after it's pre-tested. So don't despair if people are pointing out problems. This is why you're doing a pretest. Okay, it's time to get out your evaluation plan. Today we're going to be focusing on those last components, those last 3 columns on your evaluation plan, which is your data collection and analysis steps, your timeline, and your key staff. Here I've bulleted out the general things. So in fact, in the data collection and analysis steps, what I've done is I've bulleted out general steps that really probably all of you would need to do. On your evaluation plan steps, you may want to put in a bit more detail. So you could put in as much or as little as you like. You can, by the way, because it is a Word document, you can always add lines. So if you have more than 6 or 5 steps, you really have 7 steps, you can just add rows to these to your boxes, and so put in as much as you want. If you wanted to put in more detail, so for example, I might have put in a step to the number 1 that I have, which would have been to create my question criteria. So remember way back at the early part of this training, I showed you a box of criteria that you would use to determine, is this question really a question I want to use in my survey instrument? Well, that criteria might need to be adapted in really meeting your particular program evaluation needs. And so that might be something that I would do before I would even start selecting the instrument. So what we're going to do at this point is we are actually going to stop and give you time to fill it out. In our last webinar, we did get some feedback that we didn't have quite enough time to even get you really started. And so what we would like to do is to use the chat box to open it up for questions while you're putting it in. And we'll also have a poll to tell us when you're ready to move on. Of course, since we can't actually see you in person or hear you, we don't know when you're ready. So please do tell us when you're ready to move on. And I'm also going to be looking at the chat box. So if you have any questions at this point, I'm happy to start answering them. Okay, we see that people are beginning to get ready to move on. We have a few people who are ready. We're going to wait just a little bit longer. When we do these trainings in person, I get to walk around the room and look over people's shoulders at tables and see what they're doing. Here, I can just look at a poll. Oh, in the chat box. Yes, if you have any questions, be sure to go ahead. We're also going to do a Q&A at the very end, which is coming up. But if you wanted to ask something now, please feel free to. We are almost at 50%. When we get to 2/3 of you, we'll move on. So you should know that you should feel free to not feel pressured that you have to figure it all out right now and write it down. But we did want to give you an opportunity to start putting it together because I don't know about how you learn, but I know my learning style is one of having to do the task. And so if I do the task, then I start to really realize what it is that I don't understand or what I do understand, how useful it is, or maybe confusing it might be. So that's why we always want to give you an opportunity to work on the actual evaluation plan during our webinars. But we know that putting together an evaluation plan is actually takes a lot more time than we can possibly give you on these webinars. So it really is about getting you started, not getting you finished. Okay. We are really, really close. And I am going to move on. We now have 58%, which is pretty close to 63. I'm going to do an interesting rounding up. And so thank you to everybody. And let's keep going. We just have a little bit more, really not a lot at this point. So let's just review the last things that we did today. We're done for the specific training on today's webinar. And so, of course, we hope that we have increased your understanding about different types of data collection methods and that you've made some progress on selecting and understand different ways to adapt measurement tools and how to assess the quality of your questions and how to develop good questions. And, of course, we hope that you have increasing confidence on doing your evaluation. As always, we are hoping you will join us for the next webinar. The next webinar will be on collecting and analyzing data. If you've not yet signed up for the other webinars in the series, please do so at the link on this slide. At the end of today's webinar, you're going to be directed to a survey to help us improve our trainings. We really, really, really hope you'll take 5 more minutes to give us this feedback. In today's post-webinar survey, it's going to be a little bit different. We'll give you an opportunity to tell us what you're hoping to learn about in next week's webinar on collecting and analyzing data. So with that information in hand, we'll be able to customize the webinar specifically to all of you. Everyone who signed up for webinar number 1 received an invitation to join the Google group, which we have for discussing and posting questions and sharing ideas and sharing tools that you might know about. So we really hope that you join the Google group and that you do share things that you come across. Okay, let's do one last learning. I'm going to, again, look at the chat screen. And so please post questions about what is unclear from today's content or what content feels difficult to undertake. And, of course, if you have other questions, you're welcome to do that. But I thought I would give you some prompts about things that might be good things to push our way so that we can help do a little bit of clarification. Okay. We actually are kind of out of time, but I'm going to keep it open for about 2 more minutes. If you need to leave, please do. But if you still want to ask some questions, we are here. So please go ahead and ask. Okay, so far I'm not seeing any questions come in, but I'm going to still hold the webinar open for another minute because I know it takes time to type it in. And know, too, that you are more than welcome to send Sophie or me questions directly. You know, the advantages of doing it on a webinar or doing it on the Google group is that it allows for other people to see the questions and hear the answers. Because honestly, if you've got that question, you have to know that other people have it. And so it's just, you know, it's just good group learning. And I'm going to just do one more thing. I want to make sure that I do see everything that came in. I do. Okay. All right. Well, I want to thank everybody for attending today's webinar, and we hope to see you next week. We are more than halfway done with the training. please do take our survey and have a great week. Okay, bye-bye.